The year was 1867, and the American frontier was a place where death lurked behind every tree, every rock, every shadow. Families ventured west with dreams of new beginnings, but for many, the journey became their final chapter. What happened to 16-year-old Margaret Sullivan on a cold October morning would test every limit of human endurance and reveal a truth that would shatter everything her people believed about their so-called enemies. Picture this: a young girl, barely more than a child, abandoned by her own family in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hungry predators and facing certain death. But sometimes, salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and heroes don't always look like what we've been taught to expect. This is not just another frontier tale. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and an unlikely bond that defied every rule of a divided world. It's about a moment when humanity transcended hatred, when courage wore the face of the enemy, and when a single act of mercy changed two lives forever. What you're about to read challenges everything you think you know about the Old West, about family loyalty, and about the thin line between civilization and savagery. Because sometimes the real monsters wear familiar faces, and sometimes angels come disguised as warriors. Margaret Sullivan clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as the wagon wheels creaked through another deep rut. The October wind carried the scent of approaching winter across the endless Texas plains, and she could feel the chill seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. At 16, she had already seen more hardship than most women twice her age, but nothing had prepared her for what was about to unfold. Her stepfather, Jonas Mitchell, sat rigid on the driver's bench, his weathered hands gripping the reins with unnecessary force. His jaw was set in that familiar hard line that Margaret had learned to fear over the past 3 years since her mother's death. Beside her in the wagon bed, her two stepbrothers, Tom and Samuel, whispered in hushed tones, occasionally casting glances in her direction that made her stomach twist with unease. The Sullivan family had been traveling for 6 weeks now, part of a small wagon train heading toward California. They had started with 12 wagons, but disease, accidents, and Indian attacks had whittled their number down to just 5. The remaining families had grown increasingly desperate as food supplies dwindled and the weather turned harsh. Margaret could feel the tension growing thicker with each passing day, and she noticed how conversations stopped abruptly whenever she approached the other wagons. The truth was, Margaret had become a burden, and everyone knew it. Her stepfamily had made it clear from the beginning that they considered her an unwelcome responsibility inherited from her mother's previous marriage. When Martha Sullivan had died giving birth to a stillborn child, Jonas had been left with a stepdaughter he neither wanted nor could afford to keep. But social conventions and the few remaining relatives back in Missouri had pressured him into taking responsibility for the girl. Now, hundreds of miles from civilization, those social pressures seemed very far away indeed. It was Tom who had first suggested the idea, speaking in low tones around the campfire when he thought Margaret was asleep in the wagon. She had heard every word, her blood turning to ice as her stepbrother outlined his plan with casual cruelty. "She's eating food we can't spare," Tom had argued, his voice carrying just enough across the camp for Margaret to catch every horrible word. "And she ain't contributing nothing useful. Can't hunt, can't fight if Indians come. She's just dead weight, Pa." Samuel had nodded in agreement. "Besides, winter's coming, and we got barely enough supplies for ourselves. You've seen how the other families look at us. They know we're carrying extra mouths to feed." Jonas had remained silent for a long time, staring into the flickering flames. When he finally spoke, his words had sealed Margaret's fate. "There's them bear tracks we seen yesterday. Big ones. Fresh. If something was to happen to the girl out there, well, that's just the frontier for you. Dangerous place for a young woman alone." Margaret had pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp of horror. They weren't just planning to abandon her. They were planning to feed her to the bears. Now, as the wagon rolled steadily away from the main trail, Margaret realized they were putting their plan into action. The other wagons had continued straight, while Jonas had announced they needed to make a slight detour to look for water. But Margaret could see no signs of a stream or spring ahead, just endless grassland dotted with rocky outcroppings and dense thickets where dangerous animals could hide. "Where are we going, Pa?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Jonas didn't turn around. Looking for water, spotted what might be a spring from that ridge back there. It was a lie, and they all knew it. The water barrels were still half full, and they had passed a clear stream just that morning. Margaret's heart began to pound as she recognized the terrain around them. This was the same area where they had seen the massive bear tracks just 2 days ago, along with clear signs that a large grizzly had been feeding in the area. The wagon began to slow as they approached a small grove of trees nestled against a rocky hillside. It was exactly the kind of place where bears like to shelter, and Margaret could see broken branches and claw marks on several of the trees. Her stepbrothers exchanged meaningful glances, and she knew with sick certainty that this was the spot they had chosen for her execution. "This looks like good hunting ground," Jonas announced, bringing the wagon to a stop. "Margaret, you get down and gather some firewood while we set up camp. Lots of good dried branches in them trees." Margaret's legs felt like water as she climbed down from the wagon. She could see the tracks now, fresh ones in the soft earth near the tree line. Something large and powerful had been through here recently, probably within the last day or two. The bears were still active in this area, getting ready for winter hibernation, and desperately hungry. "Go on," Tom urged, giving her a push toward the trees. "We need enough wood for a good fire tonight. Take your time looking." As Margaret walked slowly toward the grove, she could hear her stepfamily beginning to pack up the wagon behind her. They weren't setting up camp at all. They were preparing to leave. When she turned back to look, Jonas was already climbing back onto the driver's bench, and her stepbrothers were securing the wagon cover. "Wait!" she called out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Aren't we making camp here? Change of plans." Jonas replied without looking at her. "We're going to push on and catch up with the others. You keep gathering that wood. We'll be back directly." But Margaret could see the truth in their faces. They had no intention of coming back. They were going to drive away and leave her here, alone and defenseless, in an area they knew was prowling with hungry bears. By the time anyone realized she was missing, the evidence would be gone, consumed by the wilderness predators that would finish what her own family had started. The wagon began to roll away, picking up speed as it headed back toward the main trail. Margaret ran after it, her worn boots slipping on the rocky ground. "Please!" she screamed, her voice echoing across the empty plains. "Don't leave me here! I'll die." Tom leaned out from the back of the wagon, his face twisted with something that might have been guilt or satisfaction. "Should have thought about that before you became such a burden, girl. This is frontier justice. Only the strong survive out here." Margaret stumbled and fell to her knees, watching helplessly as the wagon disappeared over a distant ridge. The sound of creaking wheels and horse hooves faded into silence, leaving her alone with nothing but the wind and the growing shadows of approaching evening. She was 16 years old, completely alone in hostile territory, with no weapons, no food, and no shelter. The temperature was already dropping as the sun sank lower toward the horizon, and she could hear sounds in the underbrush that made her blood run cold. Somewhere in the darkness of the trees behind her, something large was moving, following scents and sounds that had led it to this place. Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, somewhere to make a stand against whatever was coming. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The nearest settlement was hundreds of miles away, and the rest of the wagon train would be long gone before anyone realized she was missing. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret heard the sound she had been dreading, a low, rumbling growl echoing from the trees behind her. The bears had caught her scent, and they were coming to investigate. Her stepfamily's plan was working perfectly. But what none of them knew was that other eyes had been watching from the ridge above, eyes that belonged to someone who understood both the cruelty of desperate people and the harsh justice of the wilderness. The game was far from over, and Margaret Sullivan's story was just beginning. The sound of breaking branches grew louder in the darkness, and Margaret knew she had only minutes before the predators found her. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for rescue, but for the courage to face whatever came next. In her short life, she had learned that sometimes the worst monsters walked on two legs, and sometimes mercy came from the most unexpected places. Behind her, in the growing darkness of the trees, hungry eyes gleamed with predatory intent. But high above on the rocky ridge, other eyes watched with a different kind of intensity, calculating distance and timing, with the precision of a warrior who had spent his entire life reading the signs of danger and opportunity. Margaret Sullivan had no way of knowing that her greatest trial was about to become her salvation, or that the family who had abandoned her to die would soon learn that the frontier had its own harsh justice for those who forgot their humanity. From his position high on the rocky ridge, Swift Eagle watched the scene unfold below with growing anger. The Comanche warrior had been tracking this particular wagon train for 3 days, not with hostile intent, but with curiosity. His band had received reports of white settlers moving through their territory, and as one of the younger war leaders, it fell to him to observe and assess whether these travelers posed any threat to his people. What he witnessed now filled him with disgust that transcended the boundaries between their two worlds. Swift Eagle was 24 years old, already recognized among the Comanche as both a fierce warrior and a man of honor. He had seen many examples of white man's cruelty during his lifetime, but watching a family abandon their own child to die struck him as particularly vile, even by the low standards he had come to expect from the invaders. The Comanche had their own strict codes about family and loyalty. Children were precious, protected, and cherished. To deliberately abandon a young person to death would be considered one of the most shameful acts possible among his people. Even captured enemies were often adopted into the tribe rather than left to die alone in the wilderness. Swift Eagle had been born in the spring of 1843, during a time when his people still controlled vast stretches of the southern plains. His father, Bearheart, had been a respected war chief who had taught his son the ancient ways of reading the land, understanding the behavior of animals, and moving through hostile territory with the silence of a shadow. His mother, Morning Star, had died when he was 12, killed during a cavalry raid on their winter camp. That loss had hardened something in Swift Eagle's heart, but it had also taught him to recognize the value of mercy when it was earned. Now, as he watched the white girl stumble through the gathering darkness below, something in her desperate courage reminded him of his younger sister, who had been taken by soldiers during that same raid 8 years ago. He had never discovered what became of Little Dove, but the memory of her frightened face, as she was dragged away, had haunted him ever since. The girl below was clearly terrified, but not broken. Even abandoned and facing certain death, she was looking for ways to survive, gathering stones that might serve as primitive weapons, and positioning herself with her back to a large boulder that would prevent the bears from attacking from behind. Swift Eagle found himself impressed by her instincts, even as he could see that her efforts would ultimately prove futile against the massive predators that were even now circling closer through the underbrush. The sound of snapping branches and low growls told him that at least 2 large bears were closing in on her position. The girl had maybe 5 or 10 minutes before they emerged from the tree line and caught her scent fully. Once that happened, she would have no chance at all. Swift Eagle faced a decision that would have been unthinkable to many of his fellow warriors. This girl represented everything his people were fighting against: the white invasion, the destruction of their way of life, the endless stream of settlers who brought disease, violence, and broken promises in their wake. By all rights, he should simply observe her death and report back to his warband that the problem had solved itself. But something in the girl's quiet dignity, in the way she faced her abandonment without collapsing into helpless tears, spoke to something deeper in the warrior's heart. This was not one of the soldiers who had killed his mother, or the politicians who had broken treaty after treaty. This was just a child, betrayed by those who should have protected her, facing death with more courage than many grown warriors he had known. The decision came to him suddenly, with the clarity that had always guided him in moments of crisis. He would intervene, not because she was white, or because he felt any particular sympathy for her people, but because justice demanded it. The girl did not deserve to die for the sins of her stepfamily, and the cowards who had abandoned her did not deserve to escape the consequences of their actions. Swift Eagle began moving down the ridge with the fluid silence that had made him legendary among both his allies and enemies. His moccasins found purchase on loose rocks without making a sound, and his body flowed around obstacles like water finding its path downhill. He carried his war lance in his right hand and his tomahawk at his belt, but for this rescue he hoped to rely on stealth and speed, rather than direct confrontation. The bears were closer now, and he could hear Margaret's sharp intake of breath as she caught sight of movement in the trees. She had picked up several fist-sized stones and arranged them within easy reach, but Swift Eagle could see that her hands were shaking with cold and fear. The temperature was dropping rapidly as full darkness settled over the plains, and the girl's thin dress and shawl would provide little protection against the harsh night, even if she somehow survived the immediate threat. One of the bears, a massive male grizzly that Swift Eagle estimated at well over 600 pounds, was now clearly visible at the edge of the tree line. The animal's small eyes reflected what little starlight penetrated the cloud cover, and Swift Eagle could see the beast testing the air, drawing in the girl's scent and moving with the deliberate confidence of a predator that had found easy prey. Swift Eagle was still 50 yards away when the grizzly stepped fully into the open and fixed its attention on Margaret. The girl saw it too, and to her credit she didn't scream or run. Instead, she picked up one of her stones and stood up straighter. as if trying to make herself appear larger and more threatening than she actually was. "Get back!" she shouted at the massive bear, her voice cracking but carrying clearly across the open ground. "Stay away from me!" The grizzly paused for a moment, more puzzled than intimidated by this unusual behavior from what should have been helpless prey. Most animals fled or froze when confronted by a predator of this size. The girl's defiance seemed to confuse the bear, buying precious seconds that Swift Eagle used to close the remaining distance. A second bear, slightly smaller but still dangerous, emerged from the trees to the girl's left. Now she was caught between two predators, with no clear escape route and no hope of fighting them both off, with nothing but stones and determination. Swift Eagle could see her calculating the distances, trying to figure out which threat to face first. That was when he made his move. Swift Eagle burst from the shadows like an avenging spirit, his war cry splitting the night air, with a sound that was part challenge, part rage, and entirely terrifying. The piercing call echoed off the rocky hillside and sent both bears spinning toward this new and unexpected threat. Margaret whirled around too, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the sight of the Comanche warrior bearing down on the scene with deadly purpose. The larger grizzly reared up on its hind legs, standing nearly 9 feet tall and roaring its own challenge back at the warrior. Swift Eagle didn't slow his charge. Instead, he angled his approach to put himself between the bears and the girl, using his momentum and the psychological impact of his sudden appearance to seize control of the situation. His war lance was perfectly balanced, crafted from seasoned ash and tipped with a steel point that he had taken from a cavalry officer in his first major battle 3 years earlier. As the grizzly dropped back to all fours and charged toward him, Swift Eagle planted the butt of the lance in the rocky ground and braced for impact, presenting the deadly point at exactly the right angle to meet the bear's attack. The grizzly's charge carried it directly onto the lance point, which penetrated deep into the animal's chest and found its heart with the precision of a master hunter. The bear's momentum drove the weapon completely through its body, but the impact also snapped the wooden shaft and sent both warrior and beast tumbling across the rocky ground in a tangle of fur, blood, and flying debris. Swift Eagle rolled away from the dying grizzly and came up in a fighting crouch, his tomahawk now in his hand as he faced the second bear. This one was more cautious, having witnessed the fate of its companion, but it was also hungrier and more desperate. It circled warily, looking for an opening to attack without suffering the same fate as the first predator. Margaret stood frozen in amazement, clutching her stones and staring at the warrior who had appeared out of nowhere to save her life. She had heard terrible stories about Comanche raids, about the torture and death that supposedly awaited any white person who fell into their hands. But this man had just risked his own life to protect her from the bears, fighting with a skill and courage that took her breath away. Swift Eagle kept his eyes on the circling bear while speaking to Margaret in halting English, his voice calm despite the deadly situation. "Stay behind me, girl. Do not run. Bear will chase if you run." The second grizzly feinted a charge, then pulled back when Swift Eagle shifted position to meet it. The warrior was bleeding from several deep cuts where the first bear's claws had found their mark, but he showed no sign of weakness or pain. His dark eyes never left the predator as it looked for an advantage. "Why?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the dying grizzly's labored breathing. "Why are you helping me?" Swift Eagle risked a quick glance back at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart skip. There was no cruelty there, no savage bloodlust that the stories had led her to expect. Instead, she saw intelligence, compassion, and a deep anger that seemed directed not at her, but at the circumstances that had led to this moment.
"Your people," he said, his English careful but clear. "They leave you to die like animal."
This is not right thing. Not honorable. The second bear was growing bolder now, emboldened by hunger and the scent of blood from the warrior's wounds. It charged suddenly, covering the distance between them with frightening speed. But Swift Eagle was ready. He dropped low and to one side, allowing the bear's momentum to carry it past him, while he buried his tomahawk deep in the animal's skull. The bear collapsed immediately, its massive body sliding across the rocky ground before coming to rest just a few feet from where Margaret stood. She stared down at the dead predator, realizing how close she had come to becoming its meal, and felt her knees give way beneath her. Swift Eagle caught her before she could fall, his strong hand steadying her as she struggled with the overwhelming relief of being alive. For a moment, they stood together in the darkness, warrior and girl, representatives of two peoples at war, united by the simple fact that one had chosen to save the other. when he could just as easily have let her die. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, looking up into the face of the man who had rescued her. "I don't understand why, but thank you." Swift Eagle studied her face in the dim starlight, seeing not the enemy he had been taught to hate, but a young person who had been betrayed by her own family and left to face death alone. In her courage and dignity, he saw something that reminded him of the best qualities of his own people, and he found himself questioning many of the assumptions he had carried about the white invaders. But the night was far from over, and they were still in great danger. The sounds of their battle had carried far across the plains, and there were other predators in these hills besides bears. Moreover, Swift Eagle knew that his own warband was camped less than 10 miles away, and some of his fellow warriors would not be as inclined to mercy as he had been. The girl was injured, exhausted, and wearing clothing that would not protect her from the cold night ahead. If he was truly going to save her life, he would need to do much more than simply kill the bears. He would need to find a way to get her to safety, and that presented challenges that would test both his skills as a warrior and his growing conviction that some acts transcended the hatred between their peoples. As Margaret looked up at her unlikely rescuer, she had no way of knowing that her survival was about to become the catalyst for a bond that would challenge everything both of them believed about honor, loyalty, and the possibility of finding humanity in the most unexpected places. Swift Eagle examined Margaret's condition with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years surviving in the wilderness. She was clearly exhausted. Her lips were beginning to show the blue tinge of approaching hypothermia, and her thin dress was torn in several places, where she had stumbled over rocks during her desperate flight from the wagon. The night temperature was dropping rapidly, and without proper clothing and shelter, she would be dead from exposure long before dawn. "You are hurt?" he asked in his careful English, noting how she favored her left ankle when she moved. Margaret tested her weight on the injured foot and winced. "I think I twisted it when I was running after the wagon. It's not broken, but it hurts to walk." Swift Eagle nodded grimly. An injured ankle would slow them down significantly, and speed was essential if they were going to reach safety before the cold or other predators finished what the bears had started. He glanced up at the star-filled sky, reading the weather signs with the expertise his father had taught him years ago. "Storm comes before morning," he said, pointing to a barely visible line of clouds advancing from the northwest. "Much snow. We must find shelter, build fire." Margaret looked around at the barren landscape surrounding them, seeing nothing but open grassland and rocky outcroppings that offered little protection from the wind. "Where? There's nothing here." Swift Eagle was already moving, gathering useful items from the remains of the dead bears while scanning the terrain with eyes that saw possibilities where Margaret saw only empty wilderness. Cave-in rocks above. "Small, but will keep us warm." He paused in his work and looked at her seriously. "You trust Swift Eagle? Or you fear Comanche warrior more than dying from cold?" It was a fair question, and Margaret realized that everything she had been taught about Indians was being challenged by this moment. The stories told around wagon-train campfires spoke of savage warriors who tortured captives and committed unspeakable atrocities. But this man had risked his life to save hers, and she could see intelligence and honor in his dark eyes that contradicted everything she thought she knew about his people. "I trust you," she said simply. "You saved my life when you could have just watched me die. That means something." A ghost of a smile crossed Swift Eagle's face, the first expression of warmth she had seen from him. "Your people, they would not understand this trust. My people also would not understand. Sometimes, right thing is not same as easy thing." He had fashioned a makeshift pack from strips of bear hide, filling it with meat that would provide them with food for several days, and fat that could be rendered for fuel and light. From his own supplies he produced a fire kit, a water container made from buffalo bladder, and a spare blanket woven from rabbit fur that would provide Margaret with desperately needed warmth. "Can you walk?" he asked, shouldering the pack and offering her his arm for support. Margaret tested her ankle again and nodded. "I think so, if we take it slow." The climb to the cave took nearly 2 hours, with Swift Eagle supporting Margaret's weight whenever the terrain became too difficult for her injured ankle. He moved with the patient efficiency of someone accustomed to helping wounded companions, never showing impatience or frustration when she needed to rest. Several times he stopped completely to listen to sounds that Margaret couldn't detect, his hand moving instinctively to his tomahawk, before relaxing when whatever he had heard proved to be harmless. The cave he had spotted was little more than a deep crack in the rock face, but it extended back into the hillside far enough to provide excellent protection from wind and weather. Swift Eagle explored its depths carefully before allowing Margaret to enter, checking for signs of other animals that might have claimed it as a den. "Is safe," he announced, emerging from the shadows. No other creatures, we make fire here. Within minutes, Swift Eagle had a small fire crackling near the cave entrance, positioned to provide maximum warmth while minimizing the amount of smoke that might attract unwanted attention. He arranged the rabbit fur blanket for Margaret to sit on, then began preparing strips of bear meat for roasting over the flames. Margaret watched him work with growing amazement. Every movement was precise and purposeful, the result of years of training and experience in situations exactly like this. She realized that what seemed like hopeless wilderness survival to her was simply another day's work for someone who had grown up learning to read the land and use its resources. "How did you know where to find this cave?" she asked as she gratefully accepted a piece of cooked meat and wrapped herself more tightly in the warm blanket. "Father taught me to see what is hidden," Swift Eagle replied, settling down across the fire from her. "Rock speaks if you know how to listen. Wind tells stories of safe places and dangerous ones. This cave, bears knew about it too, but they had better hunting below. Now bears are dead, cave is ours." As they ate, Margaret found herself studying her rescuer's face in the flickering firelight. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably not more than 25, with strong features and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His black hair was braided with strips of leather and decorated with small feathers and beads that caught the light when he moved. Scars on his arms and chest told the story of previous battles and hunts, but there was nothing cruel or savage in his demeanor. "Why do you speak English so well?" she asked. "I mean, I'm grateful, but I didn't expect. Missionary woman came to our village when Swift Eagle was boy," he explained. "She taught words, showed how to make marks on paper that mean words. She was good woman, tried to help our people. Soldiers killed her during attack 3 summers ago." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'm sorry." "That's horrible." Swift Eagle studied her face carefully, as if weighing how much truth she could handle. "Many horrible things happen between our peoples. Your soldiers kill women and children. My warriors take captives, sometimes kill families. Both sides have much blood on hands." "But you saved me," Margaret pointed out. "Even though I'm white, even though your people and mine are enemies." "Enemy is not same as evil," Swift Eagle replied thoughtfully. "You did nothing wrong. Your family, they are cowards who leave child to die. This makes them less than animals." Swift Eagle could not watch and do nothing. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes as the full reality of her abandonment hit her again. Her own stepfamily had been willing to feed her to bears rather than share their dwindling food supplies. They had driven away knowing she would die horribly and alone, and they had felt no shame about it. "I don't understand how they could do that to me," she whispered. "I know they didn't love me, but I never thought they actually wanted me dead." Swift Eagle moved around the fire to sit beside her, his presence radiating warmth and strength. Desperate people do terrible things. Fear makes them forget honor, forget what separates humans from beasts. But this does not excuse them. What they did was wrong by any measure. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "I mean, thank you for saving me, but I can't survive out here on my own, and I can't go back to them, even if I could find them." Swift Eagle was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames while he considered the question. Margaret's situation was indeed desperate. She had no family to return to, no skills for surviving in the wilderness, and no way to reach the nearest settlement on her own. Moreover, winter was approaching, and the harsh Texas plains would show no mercy to someone unprepared for their challenges. "There are choices," he said finally. "Swift Eagle can take you to Army Fort, leave you with soldiers. They would send you back east, find white family to take you in." Margaret considered this option. It would mean safety and a return to the civilized world she had always known. But it would also mean living as a charity case, dependent on the kindness of strangers who might treat her little better than her stepfamily had. "What other choices?" she asked. Swift Eagle looked at her seriously, and she could see him struggling with something that went against everything he had been taught about dealing with enemies. "My people, sometimes they adopt captives, make them part of tribe. But this is different. You are not captive. You choose freely." Margaret felt her heart start to race. The idea of living among the Comanche was both terrifying and strangely appealing. These people had a reputation for fierceness, but they had also produced the man who had risked everything to save her life. "Would they accept me?" she asked. "A white girl?" "Some would not," Swift Eagle admitted. "But my grandmother, she has much influence in council. She lost granddaughter to soldiers same age as you. If Swift Eagle asks if you prove yourself worthy, she might speak for you. And what would that mean? Living with your people?" Swift Eagle turned to face her fully, his expression serious. would mean learning new ways, learning to work with hands, to read signs of weather and animals, to be useful to tribe. Would be hard. No soft life like white settlements. But also would mean family who would not abandon you to die. Comanche take care of their own. Margaret thought about this extraordinary offer. It would mean leaving behind everything she had ever known, learning a completely different way of life, and trusting her future to people who were supposed to be her enemies. But what did she really have to leave behind? A stepfamily that had tried to murder her? A society that viewed her as nothing more than an unwanted burden? There's something else, Swift Eagle continued, his voice dropping lower. If you come with Swift Eagle, others will say he should have let you die. Will say he is weak, maybe traitor for helping white girl. This could make trouble for him with Warband. Margaret realized that her rescuer was risking more than just his life to help her. He was potentially sacrificing his standing among his own people, his reputation as a warrior, perhaps even his place in the tribe. The magnitude of his sacrifice hit her like a physical blow. Why would you do that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Risk so much for someone you don't even know? Swift Eagle was quiet for several heartbeats, staring into the fire as if searching for the right words. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of pain and memory that made Margaret's heart ache. Had sister, about your age. Soldiers took her during raid on our winter camp. Never knew what happened to little Dove, but Swift Eagle thinks about her every day. Wonders if she died afraid and alone, or if maybe someone showed her kindness. He looked up at Margaret, and she could see the depth of his loss reflected in his dark eyes. Cannot save sister, but can save you. Sometimes, this is how healing begins. Margaret felt tears flowing freely down her cheeks now, moved by the profound generosity of this man who had turned personal tragedy into an opportunity for mercy. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of warrior training and the strength that had saved her life. If your grandmother will have me, she said quietly, I would be honored to learn the ways of your people. Swift Eagle squeezed her hand gently, and Margaret saw something that might have been relief in his expression. Then when storm passes, we go to winter camp. But first, you rest. Tomorrow will bring many challenges. As Margaret settled down to sleep, wrapped in the warm rabbit fur blanket, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in the space of a single day. This morning she had been an unwanted burden, abandoned to die by the people who should have protected her. Now she was under the protection of a warrior who had shown her more genuine kindness than anyone had since her mother's death. Outside the cave, the first snowflakes of the approaching storm began to fall, but inside, the fire crackled warmly, and Margaret felt truly safe for the first time in years. She was about to embark on a journey into a world she had never imagined, guided by a man who had proved that honor and courage could transcend the hatred between their peoples. As she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude, not just for her survival, but for the unexpected gift of discovering that sometimes angels appeared in the most unlikely forms, and sometimes the greatest courage was found in those we had been taught to fear. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping Margaret and Swift Eagle in their cave refuge, while wind and snow transformed the landscape outside into an unrecognizable white wilderness. During those long hours by the fire, Margaret began her first lessons in survival skills that would either save her life or prove her unworthy of the chance Swift Eagle was offering. He taught her how to read the subtle changes in smoke patterns that indicated shifting wind directions, how to conserve fuel while maintaining optimal heat from their fire, and how to prepare bear meat in ways that would preserve it for weeks. More importantly, he began teaching her the Comanche language, starting with essential words for food, water, fire, and safety. Pia means water, he explained patiently as Margaret struggled with pronunciations that seemed to require her tongue to move in completely unfamiliar ways. Kwa means fire. Tusape means medicine. These words might save your life if Swift Eagle is not there to speak for you. Margaret practiced diligently, repeating phrases until her throat was sore and her head ached from concentration. She quickly discovered that learning Comanche was far more difficult than she had anticipated. The language relied heavily on tone and inflection to convey meaning, and a word pronounced slightly differently could mean the difference between asking for help and accidentally offering an insult. Why is it so important that I learn this so quickly? She asked during a break in their lessons. Won't there be time to study once we reach your people? Swift Eagle's expression grew serious. When we arrive at winter camp, some warriors will say you are spy, that Swift Eagle was fool to trust white girl. Others will say you are burden who will eat food and give nothing back. You must prove them wrong immediately, or council might decide you are too dangerous to keep alive. The bluntness of his words sent a chill through Margaret, that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She was beginning to understand that her survival depended on much more than just Swift Eagle's protection. She would need to demonstrate her worth to an entire community of people who had every reason to distrust and despise her. "What kind of proof will they want?" she asked. "Must show you can work hard, learn fast, respect our ways. Most important, must show you understand that being Comanche is not just learning words and skills. Is accepting that tribe comes before self, that survival of all is more important than comfort of one person." On the second day of the storm, Swift Eagle began teaching Margaret practical skills that would be essential for life among his people. He showed her how to work with the bear hide they had salvaged, scraping it clean and beginning the process of turning raw skin into usable leather. The work was back-breaking and required a level of physical endurance that Margaret had never been called upon to develop. Her hands, soft from years of domestic work, quickly became raw and blistered from handling the rough hide. But she persevered, even when her shoulders ached and her fingers bled, because she understood that every skill she mastered was another step toward acceptance among the Comanche. "Good," Swift Eagle said approvingly as Margaret managed to scrape a section of hide clean without tearing the valuable material. "You do not give up when work becomes hard. This is important. Comanche women work from sunrise to sunset, and they do not complain about tired hands or sore back." "What will be expected of me if your people accept me?" Margaret asked, pausing to examine her blistered palms. "First, must learn all women's work. Cooking, preparing hides, making clothes, gathering plants for food and medicine. Then, if you prove yourself, grandmother might teach you sacred things. Stories of our people, songs that call spirits, wisdom of healing." Margaret found herself both excited and intimidated by the prospect. The life Swift Eagle described was harder than anything she had ever experienced, but it also offered something her old life had never provided: a sense of belonging, of being valued for her contributions rather than merely tolerated as a burden. On the third morning, the storm finally broke, leaving them with a landscape transformed by several feet of fresh snow. Swift Eagle ventured outside to assess their situation and returned with news that was both good and concerning. "Snow is deep, but we can travel," he reported. "But storm has brought other problems. Wolf tracks around cave entrance, very fresh. Pack is hunting in this area, and they are hungry after storm." Margaret felt her stomach clench with fear. She had barely survived the bear attack, and the thought of facing a pack of desperate wolves made her feel sick with terror. "How many wolves?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "At least 6, maybe more. They smell bear meat. No easy food is here. Will wait for us to leave, then follow." Wolves are patient hunters, very smart. Swift Eagle began packing their supplies with swift efficiency, his movements betraying an urgency that made Margaret's pulse quicken. She realized that their warm, safe refuge had become a trap, and their journey to his people's camp would be a desperate race against predators that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "What do we do?" she asked, helping him secure their provisions. "We run," Swift Eagle said simply. "Move fast. Stay ahead of pack until we reach hunting grounds of my people. Wolves will not follow us there." The journey began before dawn, with Swift Eagle leading the way through snow that came up to Margaret's knees. He had fashioned crude snowshoes from bent wood and strips of bear hide, which helped her move across the surface without sinking too deeply. But the effort of walking through the drifts quickly exhausted her limited strength. Behind them, Margaret could hear the wolves following at a distance, their howls echoing across the white landscape like the voices of death itself. Swift Eagle set a punishing pace, stopping only briefly to rest and check their back trail. "They are getting closer," he said grimly after one such pause. "Snow slows us down more than it slows them. Must reach Singing Creek before sunset, or wolves will attack in darkness." Margaret pushed herself harder than she had ever thought possible, her injured ankle sending shafts of agony up her leg with every step. But she could hear the predators behind them, and she knew that showing weakness now would doom them both. Swift Eagle had risked everything to save her life, and she was determined not to let his sacrifice be wasted, because she couldn't keep up. By midday, they were both exhausted, and the wolves had grown bold enough to show themselves openly, following about 200 yards behind with the patient confidence of predators who knew their prey was weakening. Margaret counted 8 of the grey shapes, massive animals with thick winter coats and eyes that seemed to burn with hunger. "Can't you shoot them with arrows?" Margaret gasped during one of their brief rest stops. Swift Eagle shook his head. "Only have 3 arrows left. Kill 1, maybe 2 wolves, but others will attack while Swift Eagle tries to reload. Better to keep running, hope to reach safe ground." They pressed on through the afternoon, with Swift Eagle occasionally dropping back to place himself between Margaret and their pursuers when the wolves moved too close. Several times he was forced to turn and face the pack directly, his tomahawk in hand and his war cry echoing across the snow, forcing them to retreat to a more respectful distance. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Swift Eagle's anxiety became more obvious. He kept scanning the landscape ahead, looking for landmarks that would tell him they were approaching the relative safety of Comanche hunting grounds. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a distinctive rock formation, barely visible through the swirling snow. "Singing Creek is just beyond those rocks. Once we cross water, wolves might give up chase." But even as he spoke, the wolves behind them let out a chorus of howls that seemed to signal a change in strategy. When Margaret looked back, she saw that the pack had spread out into a broad line, moving to flank them on both sides. "They're trying to surround us," she said, her heart hammering with fear.
Yes,
Swift Eagle replied grimly.
They know we are close to escape, so they attack now while we are still tired and weak.
The final sprint to Singing Creek became a desperate race against time and exhaustion. Swift Eagle grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her along when her strength began to fail, half carrying her when her injured ankle finally gave out completely.
Behind them, the wolves closed in with deadly purpose. No longer content to simply follow and wait, Margaret could hear their panting breath and the soft sound of their paws in the snow. When she glanced back, she saw yellow eyes and bared fangs far too close for comfort. Swift Eagle was beginning to stagger under her weight, and she realized that he was sacrificing his own chances of escape to save her life once again. "Leave me," she gasped, trying to push him away. "You can outrun them without me." "No," Swift Eagle said fiercely, his grip on her hand tightening. "We go together or not at all. This is Comanche way." The sound of rushing water reached them just as the first wolf made its attack, leaping toward Margaret with fangs bared and claws extended. Swift Eagle spun and met the creature in midair with his tomahawk, the impact sending both warrior and wolf tumbling into the snow in a tangle of fur and flailing limbs. Margaret heard snarling and the wet sound of blade meeting flesh, but she couldn't see what was happening through the cloud of snow kicked up by their struggle. The other wolves were circling closer, emboldened by their packmate's attack and sensing that their prey was finally within reach. Then Swift Eagle emerged from the melee, blood streaming down his arm from deep claw marks, but still standing and still fighting. The attacking wolf lay motionless in the snow, its skull split by the warrior's precise strike. "Run!" Swift Eagle shouted, pointing toward the creek bank just 50 yards ahead. "Cross water and climb rocks on other side." Margaret stumbled toward the sound of rushing water, while Swift Eagle turned to face the remaining wolves. She could hear the sounds of battle behind her, the ring of steel against tooth and claw, war cries mixing with snarls of rage and pain. The creek was partially frozen, with a narrow channel of fast-moving water cutting through thick ice. Margaret waded across without hesitation, gasping as the frigid water soaked through her clothes and boots. On the far side, she began climbing the steep rock face that Swift Eagle had indicated, her hands numb with cold but driven by desperate purpose. When she reached a ledge about 15 feet above the creek, she turned back to see Swift Eagle fighting a running battle as he retreated toward the water. 2 more wolves lay dead in the snow, but the remaining pack members had become more cautious, darting in to snap at him before retreating when he swung his tomahawk. Swift Eagle reached the creek bank and paused, his chest heaving with exhaustion. For a moment, Margaret thought he might be too tired to make the crossing, and she prepared to climb back down to help him. But then he heard something that made him straighten up. With renewed energy, from somewhere in the distance came the sound of horse hooves in snow and the distinctive war cries of Comanche warriors. Swift Eagle's people had heard the sounds of battle and were riding to investigate. The wolves heard it too, and their aggressive confidence suddenly evaporated. They had no desire to face a war party of mounted warriors, especially in terrain that favored their enemies. Within seconds, the entire pack had melted away into the forest, abandoning their pursuit in favor of easier prey. Swift Eagle crossed the creek with the last of his strength and collapsed on the rocks beside Margaret, breathing hard, but alive. In the distance, they could see riders approaching through the snow, moving with the fluid grace of horsemen who had been born in the saddle. "Your people?" Margaret asked, helping Swift Eagle bind his wounded arm with strips of cloth from her dress. "Yes," he replied, relief evident in his voice. "Hunting party from winter camp. They will take us home." As the riders drew closer, Margaret felt a mixture of anticipation and terror building in her chest. The next few hours would determine whether she lived or died, whether Swift Eagle's incredible gamble would pay off or doom them both. She was about to meet the people who might become her new family, or who might decide that the only good white person was a dead one. But as she looked at Swift Eagle, wounded and exhausted but still protective of her welfare, Margaret felt a deep certainty that whatever came next, she would face it with courage. He had shown her what it meant to risk everything for what was right, and she would not dishonor that lesson by showing fear now. The Comanche warriors were close enough now for Margaret to make out individual faces, and what she saw there was exactly what she had expected. Suspicion, anger, and the hard eyes of men who had lost too much to white aggression to easily forgive. But she also saw curiosity, and in some faces, a grudging respect for the courage it had taken to survive the journey to this place. Her real test was about to begin. The Comanche hunting party approached, with weapons ready, their paint ponies moving through the snow with practiced silence. Margaret counted 6 riders, all young men with the lean, dangerous look of warriors who had been shaped by constant conflict. Their faces were painted for war, and their eyes held the cold assessment of predators evaluating potential threats. The leader of the group was a man about Swift Eagle's age, with a jagged scar running from his left temple to the corner of his mouth. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Swift Eagle," he called out in Comanche, his tone sharp with disapproval. "We heard fighting and came to help, but find you protecting white captive. Explain this strange thing." Swift Eagle struggled to his feet, favoring his wounded arm but maintaining the dignified bearing of a respected warrior. When he responded, Margaret could understand only fragments of the rapid exchange, but she could hear the tension underlying every word. "She is not captive, Running Bear," Swift Eagle replied firmly. "Her own people abandoned her to die, left her for bears to eat." Swift Eagle could not watch such dishonor and do nothing. Running Bear's scarred face twisted with contempt as he looked down at Margaret. "White girl is enemy. Should have let bears finish what her people started. Now you bring trouble to winter camp." "Trouble?" Swift Eagle's voice hardened. "What trouble comes from showing mercy to abandoned child? Are Comanche now as cruel as the white soldiers who kill women and babies?" The insult hit its mark, and Running Bear's hand moved instinctively toward his knife. Around him, the other warriors tensed, clearly divided in their loyalties between the two men. Margaret realized she was witnessing a confrontation that could easily turn deadly, with Swift Eagle risking not just his reputation, but his life to defend her right to live. One of the younger warriors, barely more than a boy, spoke up hesitantly. "Swift Eagle is known for wisdom in battle. If he says girl deserves protection, maybe we should listen." "You forget yourself, Spotted Wolf," Running Bear snapped. "This is not matter for council debate. White girl is danger to tribe. Should be killed now before she can report our winter camp to soldiers." Margaret felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized how precarious her situation truly was. These men had the power to end her life with a single word, and most of them seemed inclined to do exactly that. Only Swift Eagle stood between her and immediate execution. But as she watched the confrontation unfold, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of cowering in silence and hoping Swift Eagle could protect her, she stepped forward and spoke directly to Running Bear in the halting Comanche that Swift Eagle had taught her during their 3 days in the cave. "Great warrior," she said, her pronunciation careful but clear. "I ask permission to speak." The effect was electric. Every warrior jerked in surprise, and Running Bear's eyes widened with shock. None of them had expected the white girl to know even a few words of their language, much less to address them with the proper forms of respect. "You speak our tongue?" Running Bear asked suspiciously, switching to English for her benefit. "Swift Eagle teaches me," Margaret replied, continuing to use Comanche despite her nervousness. "I learn because I want to understand ways of people who show honor. My family show no honor. Leave daughter to die like animal. Swift Eagle show true courage, save life of enemy who never do anything for him. This is greatest honor I know." Running Bear studied her face intently, looking for signs of deception or mockery. What he saw there seemed to give him pause, because some of the hostility faded from his expression. "You think learning few words makes you Comanche?" he asked, but his tone was more curious than threatening. Margaret straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye, remembering Swift Eagle's lessons about the importance of showing courage rather than weakness. "I think nothing," she said firmly. "I know I am white girl who knows nothing of surviving in this land, but I also know Swift Eagle risk everything to save my life, and I will not make his sacrifice worthless by being weak or useless. If your people give me chance, I will work harder than any woman in camp. I will learn all ways, follow all customs, earn my place, or die trying." Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with conflicting emotions. Margaret could see that her words had affected him, but she also understood that accepting her would go against everything he had been taught about dealing with enemies. It was Swift Eagle who broke the silence, speaking in rapid Comanche that Margaret couldn't follow. She caught familiar words here and there, references to honor, family, and the sacred duties of warriors, but the conversation was far too complex for her limited vocabulary. Finally, Running Bear held up his hand for silence and made his decision. "We take you to winter camp," he said to Margaret, his tone carefully neutral. "But understand this, white girl. Swift Eagle's word protects you on journey, but when we reach our people, you must face judgment of council and Grandmother Iron Dove. If they say you die, then you die. If they say you live, then you prove yourself worthy or be cast out to freeze on plains. This is only chance you get." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. She had won a reprieve, but the real test still lay ahead. Everything would depend on her ability to convince Swift Eagle's grandmother and the tribal council that she deserved the unprecedented honor of adoption into the Comanche people. The journey to the winter camp took 2 days, through harsh terrain that tested Margaret's endurance to its limits. Running Bear set a brutal pace, clearly hoping to prove that the white girl couldn't keep up with Comanche warriors. But Margaret gritted her teeth and matched their speed, even when her injured ankle screamed with agony and exhaustion made every step a battle of will. Swift Eagle rode beside her when possible, offering quiet encouragement and sharing his water when her supplies ran low. But Margaret could see that he was also being tested by his fellow warriors, who questioned his judgment and loyalty with every mile they traveled. On the second evening, as they made camp in a sheltered valley, Margaret overheard a heated argument between Swift Eagle and several of the other men. She couldn't understand all the words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile, with accusations and counter-accusations flying back and forth around the fire. "They say you have been bewitched by white woman magic," Spotted Wolf explained quietly when he sat down beside her. Unlike the others, the young warrior seemed more curious than hostile about Margaret's presence. "What do you think?" Margaret asked, grateful for someone willing to talk to her without open contempt. Spotted Wolf considered the question seriously. "I think Swift Eagle is man of honor who follows his conscience. But I also think bringing you to winter camp will cause much trouble. Many of our people have lost family to white soldiers. They will not be happy to see enemy in their midst." "What about you?" Margaret asked. "Do you want me dead too?" The young warrior was quiet for a moment, staring into the flickering flames. "My sister was captured by soldiers 3 years ago, taken from Burning Village when she was only 12. Never seen her again, do not know if she lives or dies. Sometimes I think about what I would want white people to do if they found her alone and helpless." He looked at Margaret with eyes that were sad rather than angry. "I think I would want them to show mercy, as Swift Eagle shows you mercy." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes at this unexpected compassion. "I'm sorry about your sister. I hope she's safe somewhere. Maybe she is. Maybe someone like you speaks for her when others want her dead. This is why Spotted Wolf will not argue against giving you a chance to prove yourself." The next morning brought them to the edge of a broad valley, where smoke rose from dozens of teepees scattered along the banks of a frozen stream. The Comanche winter camp was larger than Margaret had expected, with nearly 200 people going about their daily activities despite the harsh weather. As their small party descended into the valley, word of their approach spread quickly through the camp. Warriors emerged from their lodges to stare at the unprecedented sight of a white woman being brought into their midst under protection rather than as a captive. Women gathered in small groups, pointing and whispering among themselves as they tried to understand what was happening. Children ran alongside their horses, chattering excitedly in high, clear voices that carried across the crisp air. Margaret could see curiosity, fear, anger, and amazement in the faces that watched their progress, and she realized that her arrival was probably the most extraordinary event these people had witnessed in years. Swift Eagle led them directly to the largest tipi at the center of the camp, where an elderly woman sat working on a beaded leather shirt despite the cold. Even from a distance, Margaret could feel the power and authority that radiated from this small, dignified figure. This had to be Iron Dove, the grandmother whose approval would determine Margaret's fate. The old woman looked up as they approached, and Margaret found herself staring into eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom and pain of her people's long struggle for survival. Iron Dove's face was deeply lined with age and hardship, but there was nothing weak or frail about her presence. This was a woman who had survived decades of war, loss, and displacement, while maintaining the strength to guide her people through the darkest times. Swift Eagle dismounted and approached his grandmother with obvious respect, speaking in low, urgent tones that Margaret couldn't hear. Iron Dove listened without expression, occasionally asking questions that Swift Eagle answered with patient detail. Finally, the old woman's gaze shifted to Margaret, studying her with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Come here, white girl," Iron Dove commanded in heavily accented English. "Stand where I can see you properly." Margaret slid down from her horse and walked forward on unsteady legs, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. When she reached the old woman, she stopped and waited, unsure whether she should speak or remain silent. Iron Dove circled her slowly, examining her torn and dirty clothing, her blistered hands, her injured ankle. She touched Margaret's hair, testing its texture between weathered fingers, and looked closely at her face, as if searching for signs of character that couldn't be faked. "My grandson tells remarkable story," Iron Dove said finally. "Says your people left you to die, and he chose to save enemy rather than let dishonor go unanswered. Says you wish to learn our ways, become part of our tribe. This is very unusual request." "Yes, grandmother," Margaret replied, using the respectful term that Swift Eagle had taught her. "I know it is much to ask, but I have nowhere else to go, and Swift Eagle has shown me what it means to live with honor. I want to learn from people who understand courage and loyalty." Iron Dove's eyes glittered with what might have been amusement. Pretty words. But words are easy to speak when life depends on them. Proving truth of words, this is hard a thing. The old woman turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them, speaking in rapid Comanche that brought murmurs of surprise, anger, and debate from the listening warriors and women. Margaret caught fragments here and there, enough to understand that Iron Dove was explaining the situation and calling for the council's judgment. The debate that followed was intense, and sometimes heated, with various members of the tribe expressing strong opinions about what should be done with the white girl. Margaret stood silently throughout the discussion, trying to project dignity and courage, while inwardly praying that mercy would win out over vengeance. Finally, Iron Dove held up her hand for silence and delivered what Margaret sensed was her verdict. "Council has decided," the old woman announced in English. "You will be given chance to prove yourself worthy of adoption, but this will not be easy test. You must survive winter among us, learn all skills of Comanche woman, show that you can contribute to tribe's welfare rather than drain its resources. If you succeed, you will be adopted as my own granddaughter, to replace little Dove who was taken from us. If you fail, you will be cast out to find your own way in world." Margaret felt her knees nearly give way with relief and terror. She had been granted the chance she desperately needed, but the challenge ahead seemed almost impossible. How could she possibly master in a few months the skills that Comanche women spent their entire lives perfecting? "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I will not disappoint the trust you are showing me." Iron Dove nodded gravely. "We shall see, child, we shall see. Swift Eagle will teach you words and ways of warriors. I will teach you work and wisdom of women. Both paths are hard, but both are necessary if you truly wish to become one of us." As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret realized that her real journey was just beginning. The physical ordeal of reaching the winter camp had been only the first test. Now she faced the much greater challenge of transforming herself from a white settler into a Comanche woman, earning acceptance through demonstrated worth rather than inherited privilege. Swift Eagle appeared at her side, his face showing both pride in her courage and concern for the difficulties ahead. "You have impressed grandmother," he said quietly, "but do not let this make you feel safe. Next few months will test everything you think you know about yourself. Many will hope you fail, so they can say Swift Eagle was fooled to bring you here." Margaret looked around at the faces still watching her with mixture of curiosity and skepticism, and she felt a fierce determination building in her chest. These people had given her something her own family never had, a chance to prove her worth through her actions, rather than suffer because of circumstances beyond her control. "I won't fail," she said firmly. "I don't know how yet, but I won't fail. Your trust in me means too much to waste." Swift Eagle smiled, the first completely relaxed expression she had seen from him since their ordeal began. "Then welcome home, Margaret Sullivan. Now we begin the real work of making you into someone worthy of the name your new family will give you." As Margaret followed Iron Dove toward the teepee that would become her new home, she realized that she was walking away from everything she had ever been towards something she could barely imagine. But for the first time in her life, she was walking toward a future where she would be valued for who she chose to become, rather than condemned for who she happened to be born. The frontier had taken everything from her except her life and her courage. Now it was time to discover if those two things would be enough to build a completely new existence among people who had every reason to hate her, but had chosen instead to offer her the greatest gift possible, the chance to belong somewhere at last.